Catholic means universal, but in America, it has often meant white.
And that tension between what the Church proclaims and how it has lived is at the heart of today's conversation.
We're looking at the ways Catholic identity became entangled with whiteness and assimilation, shaping both the past and the present.
And we're asking what it takes to confront that history honestly and to imagine a more just Catholic future.
Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go! Welcome back to Whiplash. I'm Emma Cieslik.
And I'm Max Kuzma.
Today, we're diving into a conversation that's as challenging as it is necessary. We'll be talking about race, Catholic identity, and the histories that shape the way our communities live out the faith today.
These are themes that don't always get the space they deserve in Catholic conversations, but they're essential if we want to grapple honestly with our history and with our present.
Exactly. Confronting anti-Blackness can be uncomfortable, especially for white Catholics who may be hearing these stories and histories for the first time. But that discomfort is also an invitation to stay engaged, to reflect, and to imagine what a more just and faithful church might look like.
And to help us do that, we're joined by someone whose work really embodies that kind of honesty and imagination.
Before we begin, take a beat. This conversation includes discussions of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan, and race-motivated violence. Make sure you're in the right headspace before engaging with this content. This is not meant to discourage you, but rather to prepare you and get your full consent before we dive into this discussion.
Maureen O'Connell is a theologian, educator, and community builder whose work engages the intersections of social justice, imagination, and Catholic ethics. With more than 20 years of teaching experience in Catholic higher education, she has served on the faculty at Fordham University and teaches Christian ethics at LaSalle University. She authored Compassion, Loving Our Neighbor in an Age of Globalization in 2009, and If These Walls Could Talk, Community Muralism and the Beauty of Justice in 2012, which won the CTS Book of the Year Award and Catholic Press Association Award for Best Book in Theology. And she authored Undoing the Knots, 5 Generations of American Catholic Anti-Blackness in 2021, which explores the interplay of her Catholic and racial identities across her family's history in the city of Philadelphia. The book has been recognized as a groundbreaking exploration of racism within U.S. Catholic life, weaving historical analysis with personal narrative across generations of her own family. Maureen co-authored her newest book with Liturgical Press this year with Dr. Aaron Bingham, titled Empowering People Through Encounter, Catholic Social Teaching and Community Organizing. She serves on the advisory board of the Collaborative for Catholic Organizing and is also the director of Synod and Higher Education for Discerning Deacons, an international initiative to renew the diaconate and restore Catholic women to it. Maureen, thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm so thrilled by your invitation to be part of the important conversations you're holding space for here.
Thank you so much. So we're going to do things a little bit differently than we traditionally do with diving into a question. Many of you know that we start with a content statement, but today we're going to think critically about welcoming everyone into the conversation and challenging our own biases to maybe tune out. Confronting anti-Blackness is critical, but this may be the first time that many white Catholic listeners do so. What can they do to prepare for this episode? We normally include a content statement, which we will do, but how can we include an invitation for all of us to stay engaged when hearing hard histories that challenge our own histories?
I really appreciate this invitation to start the conversation this way. And I think what I am continuing to learn as I continue to do this work alongside others is just to recognize that racism impacts all of us and to be curious about the ways in which it might have shown up in our own history, and the ways that it might actually have shaped negatively our own experiences of trying to be human and trying to live in community. So it's not entering in a place of judgment or guilt or shame, but with a softness of heart, perhaps with a bit of humility, and also I think just curiosity. Just having a curious mind makes it hard to have a defensive or a judgmental or even a shamed one.
I love that so much. I think, especially, often just with LGBTQ issues, we're so often asking people really for openness. Start with openness and see where that leads you.
Yeah, I've also heard somebody say, and I'm sure you have as well, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that we know any kind of conversion process, whether individual or collective, is going to require a fair amount of discomfort. And so the ability for some of us who aren't often operating out of a space of discomfort to learn how to do that is an important contribution that we can make towards the liberation of all peoples.
Absolutely. Could not have been said better. Maureen, in Undoing the Knots, you weave together 5 generations of your family story to examine how white Catholics in America became entangled in racism. You also write from the perspective of a theologian and educator who has spent years teaching, writing, and working for social change. Could you share how your own background, both in your family's Catholic story and in your academic journey, brought you to the point of writing this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in truth, it was the book that I wrote about the community mural movement here in Philadelphia that brought me to this book. And in large part, that was because I spent several years in researching that book, hunting for community murals that articulated the divine or brought to the public square notions of the sacred or the holy from different religious traditions. I went hunting around in neighborhoods all over the city of Philadelphia. And this was actually before you could plug something in on a Google, on your phone and just kind of very easily get from point A to B. There's a lot of meandering. And because I did that research while I was at Fordham University, I would come home to Philly, and then I would, my mom would be my co-pilot in the family minivan. And so we would be driving around neighborhoods, and she would be pointing out, well, this is the church where your great grandparents got married, and this is the church that your aunts and uncles were baptized in, and oh, this is the church that I was baptized in. And I just all of a sudden realized the way, because I entered into those spaces and got out of the car in those spaces and sometimes was taking pictures of murals in those spaces, it became more real to me as I entered into the space how much my own family's history was interwoven throughout the Catholic landscape of the city of Philadelphia. My lived experience was on the inner ring suburbs, right? I grew up in a parish established in the 1920s in the inner, in a suburb just over the city line. But my parents were the first to raise their children in that space. So it was just this realization of how connected we were. And then it just also, for me, raised a bunch of questions, the answers to which I knew intellectually. Well, how do we get so separated, disengaged from, distanced from these sacred spaces that were so important for the faith formation of the people who came before me, that were so important for building communities that sustained, in many ways, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia. I knew the answers to those intellectually, but I kind of wanted to enter into them a bit more spiritually, a bit more emotionally, and wanted to know the stories, right? And I'd heard, as I'm coming from an Irish family, the tall tales of all these people. But I think I wanted to learn a little bit more of the complete story, so that when I would bring pilgrims, because I often do mural pilgrimages around the city, when I would bring pilgrims back into those spaces, I could feel like I could tell a more honest story about about those spaces and the relationships between white Catholics and the people who remain in those spaces, live in those spaces, are making neighborhoods out of those spaces right now. And just be more honest, and therefore perhaps have a bit more integrity in trying to do this work.
Absolutely. I love that so much. And it reminded me one of when I first moved to Washington, D.C. about 3.5 years ago, one of my favorite joys of the city was going on weekend excursions. So basically taking the public transit as far as I could and finding a way to walk back
Wow.
um, with safely within the city. And one of the things that I came across during those weekly excursions was St. Augustine Catholic Church, an incredibly prominent and historical African American Catholic church in Washington, D.C. So just as you say, knowing our own histories is knowing the rich history of Black Catholic churches
Mm-hmm.
throughout the United States
Mm-hmm.
and abroad. So, in the United States, this church was founded in 1858 by emancipated Black Catholics who had previously segregated at St. Matthew's Cathedral, known as the Mother Church of Black Catholics and an important center for Black Catholic culture and heritage. It also established a school for Black children in 1858, 5 years before the Emancipation Proclamation would be signed in the United States. I just wanted to share that critical history because so much of what you talk about and what you highlight are stories of Black Catholic history and culture that are often not discussed in mainstream white Catholic narratives. So,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the rich history of how St. Augustine contributed to the landscape of what Catholic identity looks like in the
Mm-hmm.
capital is critical.
Yeah, that's great, Emma. That's really important to name. And that like process of discovery, I think, is also is really important. It gets to that curious as opposed to defensive and even fearful posture that we often
Absolutely.
bring. Yeah.
100%. And we did have one more follow up question because I
Mm-hmm.
love what you shared. So, how did you move from your training with Christian ethics to more of this historical analysis? I
Mm-hmm.
know with your background in ethical teaching and social organizing, how did this shift to a focus on understanding the history behind these
Mm-hmm.
cultural forces
Yeah.
and sharing it with others?
That's another really good question. I mean, so in truth, I was a history major as an undergrad. So that curiosity about the past is very significant for Enneagram folks out there in the world. I'm also an Enneagram 4, and the posture for the Enneagram 4 is looking at the past, looking over the shoulder,
Mm.
lingering, recognizing that things of the past have something important to share with the future. I would also say that a third place that this comes from is just my own father raised us, myself and my three siblings, to be really conscious of history. So whenever we would go on vacations, before we went to Disney World, we went to the Jesuit missions, right, and San Juan Capistrano. So imagine a bunch of pre-10-year-olds wanting just to get to Disneyland, but here we are learning the history of the mission. So I just think it was part of my own formation. But in truth, I think the desire, Emma, to try to be historical in this was I had done a fair amount of learning about racism and anti-racism through a small cohort of colleagues in the world of Catholic theology, probably, not long after I got my PhD and started to do some of my work. And there weren't a lot of folks doing this work. And I just learned, and I think this is also through some exposure to community organizing around that time, that stories are things that can truly invite people into conversion experiences, right? Organizers will sometimes say people change people, ideas don't change people. And so having engaged or experienced a fair amount of resistance around when it came to trying to teach or talk with people about racism, I found that if you lead with story, there's a way in which that's very invitational. There's a way in which that grounds people in their own lived experience. There's a way in which it allows for some connection beyond the ideologies that often are the things that keep us from seeking and reaching a deep shared understanding. And I also think that history, that whoever it was, I think it's Twain who said history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. I think looking to the past and seeing patterns while sometimes can feel frustrating, that also can be something that's quite liberating because it suggests that no, there are circumstances and humanly created structures and systems that continue to yield results that if we wanted to make some change, we could change some systems and structures and cultures and perhaps arrive at a different outcome. So yeah, that's a little bit of everything in that answer. But I find history incredibly illuminating.
Mm, yeah. I am not at all historically trained. I did see Emma get very happy when you said you were a history major in your undergrad. But I also see the same significance of really learning lessons. And also, for me personally, like when the reelection of Trump happened and his inaugural day, and he's all these executive orders, some of which personally targeted me as a transgender person.
Mm-hmm.
I felt a lot of solidarity in that time when I thought back to, for example, the experience of gay and lesbian people during the AIDS crisis and
Mm-hmm.
the way that communities come together and take care of each other stands so opposed to just systems of power that we see rising throughout history. So I
Yeah.
am fully on board with all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, Max, I appreciate your idea of, and you shared this with me, and this is why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to engage with you because it's been just as much of it's been a great learning experience for me. This notion of historical solidarity, I think,
Mm,
is really key, and you just lifted that up. And I think for me, because so much of our history around racism as a nation, but also as a Catholic Church, has been whitewashed, if not completely ignored and untold. Going back in and learning some of that history helped me discover figures that are luminaries for me as a white Catholic woman,
mm,
women who resisted, who offered
mm,
alternatives, who refused to go along with the dominant culture and even the leaders of the church in Philadelphia. So that's been such an important source. In fact, before joining you, I like invoked the spirit of one of those people, a woman named Anna McGarry, who, anyway, we can talk a little bit more about her down the road. But just, I think that that's an important resource that we make available to our people when
mm.
we tell honest histories. It allows us to get in touch with and be in solidarity with some of those prophetic figures who can give us courage for what we're trying to do right now.
Absolutely. And I know that also even ties into a lot of work Emma has done, researching and uplifting in essays and publications about the history of LGBTQ and queer saints.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Emma's work was some of the first that I found that showed those people to me. And as you say, it's examples of people to connect to. And I also just want to say as well, like, it's something that often gets missed when there's performative allyship and tokenizing.
Mm-hmm.
If, for example, if I become only a trans voice that's turned to only about a piece of trans news or in these like very specific circumstances, that actually takes away something from not only allies who would be able to just learn more just from me having the opportunity to speak on other issues, but also from the younger trans people who, they also deserve the opportunity to hear from a trans adult, like just reflecting on the spiritual journey, not just in times of crisis or just in the headlines. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Shifting back to your book, Undoing the Knots, which I think is kind of going to guide a lot of our conversation here, especially because I really love it. I thought it was super well written and such an important piece of work.
Thank you.
So you devote part of the book to the story of a Philadelphia celebration where
Mm-hmm.
Catholic leaders, seeking affirmation at a time when Catholics were themselves outsiders, borrowed from the playbook of the KKK to assert their belonging. It's such a striking example of how assimilation, Catholic nationalism, and racism
Mm-hmm.
became intertwined in US history. Could you walk us through that story and help us think about what it reveals about the ways Catholic identity was constructed in relation to white supremacy?
Mm. Yeah, thanks. So, um, This was a story that I discovered when I was trying to understand the lived experience of my great grandparents on my mother's side, both of whom arrived from Ireland in the first half of, or the first decade of the 20th century. And they were at a really big parish on Broad Street in Philadelphia called St. Stephen's. So I went looking around in the archives at St. Stephen's, and I stumbled in most of this work. I just stumbled into things that felt like they were waiting to be discovered, which was very uncanny. But in the 1920s, much like Philadelphia today, in the 1920s, the city was preparing for the sesquicentennial celebration. So the 150th anniversary of the founding of the country. We're getting ready to host the 250th, which is the semi-quincentennial. But it was called, in 1926, it was called the Sesqui. And there was a huge fairground that was built to host for 6 months a World's Fair type gathering. And this was in the age of the big World's Fairs. And the KKK had applied to hold a convocation, CLONO, convocation, there in Philadelphia. They had held one, a smaller one, in front of the White House the year before, and their application for this was accepted by the Sesquicentennial Committee. And there was not a lot of pushback about this, except for some of the Jewish members of that sesquicentennial committee, several of whom were prominent businessmen in the city. And so at the very last minute, this was supposed to happen, at some point in July. At the very last minute, this convocation is canceled. And interestingly, and their plan was to parade down Broad Street and then go to the banks of the river and have a big meeting. So when I went into the archives of the archival material that's available about the Cardinal of Philadelphia at the time, Dennis Doherty, it's very interesting to me that in the spring of that same year in 1926, there's some correspondence that Doherty receives from a parish on the far edges of the city, still in the city limits, but way in the far northeast of the city. And the Klan had burned a chapel on the premise of this parish, and so the priest there was writing to the Archbishop, "I want to alert you," and included a pamphlet where there was going to be a Klan meeting, and Doherty was named as, a force that needed to be reckoned with and needed to be taken down. He was sort of the embodiment of the encroachment of Catholics in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and they needed to be stopped at all costs. So Doherty's aware of this in April. Sometime in the high summer, the convocation is canceled. So there's kind of this, I don't want to say that there's a gap in the program, but the seeds for what the Klan were doing were kind of planted in the ethos of the folks who were thinking about what to do and contribute to the sesquicentennial. So in October of 1926, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia holds a giant mass in the Sesquicentennial Stadium. So a mass for 250,000 Catholics. And there was an overflow of like 10 or 15,000 Catholics who couldn't get in. And the pastor at St. Stephen's offered the liturgy for those folks. So that's kind of how I kind of was like, oh, what was going on with this sesquicentennial? So my people would have known the backup pastor, right? The overflow pastor. But the Archdiocese orchestrated this in a short amount of time, a remarkable march of all of these Catholic men down South Broad Street. So imagine a 3 or 4 mile stretch from City Hall down Broad Street to the Sesquicentennial Stadium. Every parish had a side street that they were to form up on so that they could feed into the main parade. And these men walked 16 across, 8 from the east side of Broad, and 8, it was incredibly orchestrated. Every parish, right? And so, it's hard not to think of like, we're going to do our own march. We're going to step in and sort of, trump the Klan in terms of their own plan, or the Klan wants a march, we'll show the Klan a march. So there was no acknowledgement of Catholics being targeted. There was just this really, I think, strong, dare we say, muscular response. The second thing I noticed in this was that most of the national parishes had been closed at this point. Cardinal Doherty, before he arrived on the scene in the Archdiocese, the Polish Catholics had their parishes, and the German-speaking Catholics had their parishes, and the Italians had their parish. And Doherty was like, nope, we're not going to do that. We are going to be, one Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia, albeit sort of under the authority of an Irish Catholic Philadelphian, or not Philadelphia, but person leading Philadelphia of Irish Catholic descent. But that was not applied to the Black parishes. The Black parishes remained segregated by race, right? And so they appear in all of the planning for this sesquicentennial with a C next to their name for colored, right? So the colored parishes are identified as such. And then when I started to look at the streets and where the colored parishes were to feed into this parade, it landed them in the back of the line, and therefore at the back of the gathering, right on the floor of the sesquicentennial mass. So there's this, here's Doherty, to my mind, exercising a kind of strong, exceptional expression of Catholicism, right? If this is a moment in the nation's history, kind of like the moment we're in right now, where if you are a good American, you are a Christian American. Doherty was kind of saying, yeah, not only are you a good American if you're a Christian American, you're an even better American if you're a Catholic American. And some of the language from the homily that was given sort of reflects that Catholics are the ideal American. And then also exercising sort of the key thing in understanding anti-Blackness and the immigration experience of America is one of the fastest ways that you can become white in America is to reject the Americanness and even the humanness, and in the case of the Catholic Church, the Catholicness of Black people. So we see that being exercised, right? That there's this opportunity with a threat that is made and violence that is perpetrated against Catholics in that spring of 1926, rather than seeing that as a call to solidarity with the other people that the Klan is targeting at that time. We deny them, we ignore them, and we articulate the sense that white Catholic Christianity is the most patriotic expression of Americanness in this sesquicentennial celebration. The one other thing I'll just quickly add about this story, which gets back to Emma's discussion about St. Augustine's in DC. The parallel parish here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia is St. Peter Claver, which was founded in part with some funding through Catherine Drexel, who was a Philadelphian, St. Catherine Drexel. Also in those papers, those Doherty papers in the spring of 1926, intermingled with these correspondences with this priest who's talking about the violence being experienced by the Klan, three Black women from St. Peter Claver write first in a handwritten note to the Archbishop saying, we're from St. Peter Claver Parish, and we are very eager to contribute to the exhibits that the Archdiocese might be putting together for the exhibit hall during the Sesqui. We're eager, and we seek your counsel on how we can be involved. And in pencil, and they don't hear from him. And then there's a typewritten note maybe 3 weeks later from these same women. And in pencil, you can see that the secretary for the Archbishop, writes in the corner, these people are to be told that the Archbishop does not want to have a hand in this matter. So there's this refusal to accept the gifts and the contributions coming from a historically Black Catholic parish to the Sesqui event. They're ignored. We don't know what their contribution would have been. And instead, the energy is given to this this really, I can only imagine how dramatic the display of Catholic Christian nationalism or Catholic nationalism that was. And I can't help but think that any of my relatives who were male relatives, teenage years or above, would not have been part of that march of 80,000 men, Catholic men, down Broad Street in Philadelphia. So that was just really something to linger with and think about, and continues to be the case as we prepare next year for the semi-quinten, the 250th.
Yes, I know it's been on my mind, especially working for a large museum based here in Washington, D.C. We've been preparing and thinking about how that history will be in many ways regulated
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, right.
by,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you
Mm-hmm.
understand completely, by
Yes,
White House
yeah,
officials and by
yeah,
government.
yeah.
Um, I really loved what you said, and I just want to emphasize it, that the idea of um, not accepting and rejecting the gifts of these communities for the
Mm-hmm.
reason of not being involved in this political issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to highlight that this is something we've seen most recently with LGBTQ plus communities,
Mm-hmm.
of not wanting the church to take a stand related to LGBTQ plus issues surrounding conversion therapy. Often in the opposite, purely because they are politicizing the community.
Mm-hmm.
And viewing it as inherently tied to combating far right political forces.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important to highlight because it's the same strategy that we see going
Mm-hmm.
on today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't want to have a hand in this, right? So, I'm going to be talking later today, and so this is why prepping for our conversation was really helpful with a Mercy High School here, and some of the questions that folks there want to talk about is, how can we encourage the diocese to be more visible in its stances around ICE raids that are happening in the city right now? And so how can we start to see and be informed by what leadership did then, and alternatives that were available then, and alternatives that are available now? And how do we work with our leadership, not demonize our leadership, because I don't think that helps at all. How do we serve it as co-responsible disciples for the mission of the church in being visible around policies and practices and performances that we know are meant to reject the Americanness and the humanness of certain populations of people right now?
100%. And I think that feeds very well into our next question about assimilation.
Mm.
So, assimilation has long been a way to define who counts, as you say, as fully Catholic, particularly in relation to race. From the struggles of early Catholic immigrants eager to prove themselves as American enough, to the structural pressures that shaped white Catholic communities, these boundaries have been policed in ways that mirror other social hierarchies. And certainly, Max and I have seen how this impulse manifests within social purity movements and even identity change efforts like conversion therapy, which we have termed part of high control Catholicism. As you've spoken to it in this story of the sesquicentennial,
And maybe we'll
the
just call the
sesqui.
next one the sesqui.
The sesquicentennial. How do you see assimilation functioning historically as a mechanism of control, and what insights does examining that history offer for understanding Catholic identity today in the United States?
I want to speak out of my own experience with this and my family's experience, and then speak out of what I learned, from looking at the experiences of Black Catholics in the
Absolutely.
Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I think the first place that I experienced this in my own lived experience, and I think this is at the heart of the invitation in the conversion process of becoming anti-racist or becoming racially just and becoming, intentional with that this is a process that doesn't end, that this is much like growth in a spiritual life or any kind of spiritual practice. It invites and encourages ongoing growth. The first place that I really wrestled with this was, my family first arrived. Most of my family came from Ireland. I do have some folks that came from Germany and Poland, but most of my family came from Ireland. And, I've asked my mother and her siblings, well, what were the things that you did growing up or that you learned from, because my great grandmother lived with my mother and her siblings when they were children. What did Mima like, what was, Irish and Catholic about Mima? What do you remember? Were there feast days other than St. Patrick? Were there prayers? Were there rituals that happened around in the kitchen around cooking? Or were there ways of showing up in liturgy? Like, I was looking for the trappings of the Irishness of their identity. And like, everybody kind of scratched their head. I mean, yes, we have a really good recipe for Irish soda bread. But like, we just don't have those things. And I'm deeply envious of colleagues who come from other ethnic traditions where the ability to assimilate was not as easily accessible. So, and so they do have all of these feasts and all of these saints and all of these songs. And so part of what I learned was that, because all of my ancestors could pass as white, they immediately could give up, trade in the distinctively Catholic things about the places in the world in Europe that they came from to become an American Catholic. And so, like Doherty sort of saying, we're going to get rid of all of this ethnic distinctiveness in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And because Irish Catholic prelates, whether born in Ireland or eventually, formed in seminaries here in the United States, they became the leaders of the American church, for the first at least century of the church here in the United States. There was this expectation that you just assimilate into the dominant expression of Catholicism, white Catholicism. So I mourn the fact that I don't have these particular spiritual resources that I think would be of huge importance and help for me in trying to resist the homogenization of Christianity and the consolidation of power around a particular expression of Christianity and even around a particular expression of Catholicism. But I want to acknowledge it was a privilege for those folks in my history and my family to be able to trade those things in. Right. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, like, I do think there was a lot of harm done to my white people in that assimilation process. And I want to acknowledge it's not the same harm, and there's lots of different harms and traumas. And I'm not trying to create a hierarchy or an Olympics of suffering in any way. And at the same time, I think part of what can be an important motivator for white folks, for like myself, in doing this work is sort of to say, yeah, some of my self-interest in wanting to undo racism is that I want to heal from the harms that it's also done to me. The first exercise I engaged in, the first archival hunt I went on for this project, I went to a suburban county archive because I wanted to find an ad that my grandfather, my mother's father, who was a housing developer, would have taken out for the housing development he was building between the late 40s and the early 50s. And I suspected that would have been a white-only housing division, because he would have gotten money from the FHA, and the FHA was only lending to builders who would commit to not selling their homes to Black buyers. So I'm going to look for this ad, right? And I'm like, let's just start with 1950 and see what happens. And literally on the first reel of microfilm I put in, I'm scrolling through looking at the Norristown Times-Herald starting in January in 1950. And there's not even real estate sections at that point. And I see whiz by me something about St. Francis of Assisi School. And I know that's where my mother was a first grader. And I look, and the headline is St. Francis of Assisi performed St. Patrick's Day minstrel show. And so I look at this article, and my mother and my uncle's names are listed as first graders who were part of this fundraising performance. They needed to raise money on St. Patrick's Day to get out of that parish hall into a church building. They wanted to build a church building. And the adults towards the end of that program are in blackface, right? There's the makeup crew, the men, all male makeup crew, right? So it just was shocking to me. And I thought to myself, like, wow, what is that? What is that communicating? This is the first time first family members are out of the city into the suburbs, building a white only suburban subdivision, and in their parish hall on St. Patrick's Day, experiencing a minstrel show. What did that do? What did that do to my mom and my uncle? Um, how did my grandparents parse some of that? They had a black housekeeper. Like my grandfather had a black lawyer. What kind of mental gymnastics, what kind of knots did they have to tie themselves into? And then how did those tied up knots get handed down to me? So those are both expressions, I think, of assimilation. There was an expectation that you're moving out to the suburbs, bring that same anti-Black culture that you experienced in the city into the suburbs, to make sure that these are white spaces, and anybody coming out here knows that they're expected to assimilate into a dominant culture that wants to reject the humanity of Black people, or sees Black people and Black neighbors as liabilities, right? So, I think that assimilation has come at extreme cost to people who get the privilege to assimilate. And then I think what I've learned about the impact of assimilation on communities of color in the Archdiocese is that these places get labeled as missionary parishes. We still call them mission schools in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, right? And these places, these parishes and these schools, historically, the Archdiocese outsourced the ministry in these places to congregations of religious men and women who had in their own charism and their own missions a commitment to accompanying people who were marginalized or people who were economically disadvantaged. So while that, I think, was probably good, because in some ways I think a lot of really good care was taken of those folks, that was unstable, right? As soon as those congregations can be redeployed, right? The Archdiocese is not making any kind of institutional commitment to these communities. They're kind of outsourcing it. And I think we could say the same is true. We outsource the philanthropy of the mission schools rather than saying, no, we've got to figure out how we are accompanying some of the parishes that were and schools that were either immediately segregated and labeled as colored, or who were left behind, through the process. And I got this really great understanding of the role of the missionary from a theologian named Willie James Jennings. And he talks about, in the history of colonialism, the missionary's job was to create a false peace between the merchants who were there to, exploit the people and the resources and the land and to make the money for the people in positions of power, and the soldier who was there to protect the ability of the merchant to do that, right? And that obviously created violence and conflict. And the missionary was to come in and kind of create a false peace, particularly through that notion of assimilation and that sense that if you assimilate, you will be saved. So I think even as we talk about missionary discipleship in our current ways of thinking about evangelization, I think we have to be really attentive to that history and the way in which assimilation was always at the heart of missionary work, and impacts everybody in a way that doesn't allow people to show up with the kind of cultural distinctiveness and variety of gifts that we know exist in the body of Christ.
Absolutely. I just want to affirm what you said, and also to highlight that this was something that I had discovered and learned more about in college, specifically because I attended Ball State University, located in Muncie, Indiana, East Central Rust Belt territory. And Muncie was actually selected by sociologist Robert and Helen Lind for the Middletown Studies. So it was studies in the early 20th century dedicated to identifying and understanding what the life of prototypical middle class small town America was. And the interesting thing was they published published the first of the studies in 1929, Middletown, A Study in Contemporary American Culture. And then Middletown in Transition, examining how this small Rust Belt town was changing over time in response to economic and cultural shifts. The interesting thing, though, however, was that as a result of this, a number of people's histories were not included in this initial investigation. Muncie, like many other small town Indiana towns, was a sundown town,
Mm.
meaning
Mm.
that individuals of color were not permitted within the
Mhm.
city limits after dark.
Mm.
It also meant that people of color and Jewish individuals, which I researched during my undergrad, were not permitted to own houses in certain parts of Muncie development, just as you talk about in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And what you talk about is a key part of what Ball State is doing. There's the whole project called the Middletown Digital Oral History Project, dedicated to recording the experiences of African American,
That's great.
Jewish, and Catholic communities
Mm.
in Muncie that were previously undiscovered. So I want to highlight that what
That's
you're doing is
awesome.
very groundbreaking, because a lot of this work highlighting how race, religion, and gender
Mm.
are key elements in this force of assimilation, are
Mhm.
new developments in
Mhm.
history fronts focused on how this assimilation is a transgenerational
Yeah.
trauma force
Yeah.
that is affecting not only us, but also many other groups within the Catholic Church and outside of it that are grappling currently with these ramifications.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, I love that you were invited into that work as an undergraduate. And in truth, like I also was with, a particular professor. And I think it just underscores the importance of classroom spaces as places of inquiry and places of curiosity and places of discovery for things like that. I think that's fascinating. I'm definitely going to check that project out, Emma. That's really neat. And it's neat that you were kind of in part of its inception. That's great.
The reason I got involved with it, and the reason I actually got involved in studying Catholicism at all,
Mm-hmm.
was the fact that I learned about oral history and started conducting archival research focused on Muncie's Jewish population
Wow.
historically,
Okay.
because we saw while I was on campus
Mm-hmm.
a severe increase in anti Semitic
Mm.
violence. And
Mm.
as a result, we were researching how that parallels or contrasts with
Yeah.
historical
Yeah.
anti Semitic violence in Muncie. And so it was through that and
Yeah.
learning these histories of assimilation that I personally
Yeah.
became interested in my own
Fascinating.
Catholic framework.
That's cool.
So it was through this work that
Yeah.
I fell in love with the
Yeah.
work that Max and I do every
That's
single day.
amazing. It's really, really great.
So, building on some of these historical details and histories and perspectives, we can see how Catholic identity today intersects with far right politics, traditionalist movements, and even the media amplification element. So, how do the dynamics of assimilation that you've studied inform a bit of what we're seeing now in modern Christian and Catholic nationalism, a little bit through the lens of what Emma and I have termed high control Catholicism? And what does that suggest about the ways power and control are being exercised in contemporary communities of faith?
Yeah. Wow. That's a great question. And I have to say right from the beginning, like this book came out in 21. I started the research on it probably in 2017. It's remarkable. Anyway, I can't believe where we are right now, today in our culture. Um, and so I just think, again, I appreciate your invitation to revisit this and start to think about its implications for the here and now. I'm also really grateful to the both of you for helping to explain to me the notion of, high control Catholicism. Again, if I had had that, I would have incorporated it in the book, because I think it really helps articulate when we want to talk about Catholicism, or we want to talk about anti-Blackness in Catholicism and the way it actually shapes cultures and individual practices and frameworks for understanding it becomes really clear. And one of the things that I learned in looking at some of your own work that I think resonates around with high control Catholicism, that resonates around racism, is this idea of prioritizing institutions over people. Right. And that part of high control is like, we're always privileging the institution. In the case of the church, we're always privileging the institutional church. So an understanding of church as institution, not necessarily understanding of church as people of God or understanding church as messenger, thinking of Avery Dulles' different models of church, understanding really church as institution, and sort of sacrificing everything else in the name of upholding institutions. When I was doing my work, I read Alexei Ignatieff, his book, How the Irish Became White. And he had this quote in there that made a ton of sense, I think, for whiteness, how Americans become white, and then also for Catholics. And so he said, to be an American is to uphold American institutions and not necessarily American values. So, I mean, here we are, 2025. I think we could run through a list of the ways in which the number of institutions we're supporting is being consolidated, but that we're asked to support through a particular lens at the sacrifice of values is very true. For me, the corollary to that was to become an American Catholic is to uphold American Catholic institutions, schools, parishes, bishops' conferences, but not necessarily Catholic values, right? And so I think that is something that I saw very clearly through my research, and I think is something that we need to ask ourselves about today. I'm teaching a course on social justice and community organizing right now, right? And we are looking at modes of discipleship, recognizing that there's a multiplicity of ways of understanding discipleship. Obedience, unquestioning obedience, perhaps being one, of many ways of understanding discipleship. So, I think that prioritizing institutions and the well-being of institutions and the survival of institutions, particularly in times of decline, like we know that in truth, the Catholic Church in the United States is grappling with decline. In my own diocese of Philadelphia, a recent study shows that 83% of people who identify as Catholic are no longer coming to church, coming to Mass. So that, that raises a bunch of questions, and our responses are really important. And I think being attentive to the historical pull and the muscle memory of wanting to uphold and resource and prioritize institutions over the call of the gospel to accompany and radically love the neighbor, I think is the crossroads that we're at right now. And another reason for doing these histories, as we've kind of been talking about, we find examples throughout our histories of people who did not prioritize the church as institution, but prioritized the church as the people of God, the church as the body of Christ, the church as the wounded body of Christ. And those are examples that we need now more than ever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And following up on that, your work bridges Christian ethics, critical race theory, and social justice, showing how academic reflection and lived experience can inform one another. Your scholarship emphasizes both rigorous analysis and moral responsibility, highlighting the ethical dimensions of Catholic life in the United States and the ways faith communities engage with issues of race and power. How have these academic frameworks influenced the ways you think about moral responsibility within the church, and how they intersect with lived experiences of race and power?
Wow. That is a really, that's a question to journal with, in truth, Emma. And I think I need you to resend it to me so that I can do that. I think what I've been learning through my own vocational journey as an educator is that when we risk believing what the people are not just listening to the people on the margins or the people closest to the pain in our social realities, but when we actually risk believing them and risk figuring out what it means to come alongside them, to walk alongside them, to lend the gifts that each of us have to the vision of flourishing or the vision of the common good, or the vision of life and community that these folks have, and in many instances live more fully than some of us who are in homogenous or in defensive and isolated pockets of apathy and fear and guilt and sometimes intentional indifference. it just opens up unexpected. The paths forward, different paths forward emerge, and there's a way in which I'm very grateful for just the ability to become more fully alive. I think as a Christian disciple, as a theologian, as an educator, when I've stepped out of that like ethic of control that comes from high control Catholicism, and like we can acknowledge like the academy has a role to play in that. Which ideas count, which sources of and methods of scholarship count, who are the people whose voices get privileged in different spaces, how are we policing each other in the work that we do. I've just found that when I've tried to engage more in an ethic of risk or vulnerability that just says, I have so much more to learn, and I want to figure out what's the most impactful way that I can bring my gifts to the work of social change and liberation. That's hard work, but it's incredibly purposeful. And it's something that actually gives me hope and purpose precisely in times where the forces are trying to deny that of us, want us not to be able to tap in to those reserves of moral courage, and the certitude that comes from a collective discernment about the direction and the steps we could take together as communities. Risking saying that no, everybody belongs in this circle. So again, that's probably more of a reflective answer than an academic answer, but it has taken me in some really unexpected turns in my own professional development. I think I shared with you at the top of the conversation, I have left my tenured position at LaSalle University, which was a really important space for my own faith formation, mostly because I feel like the call right now in our church is to serve this process that Pope Francis has tried to revitalize in the church called synodality. And I think this is the way that we heal. This is the way that we build bridges. This is the way that we create unity, not through uniformity, but through the cacophony of voices and gifts that are on hand and on offer and are stirred up by the Holy Spirit. So, yeah, I'm grateful for the folks who I've gotten to know, past and present. Speaking of historical solidarity, right? The folks of the past who give me courage, and the people that I get to do really exciting and fun work with right now, for being able to take some leaps that I don't think I would have otherwise.
Absolutely. And I just want to affirm what you said about recognizing and uplifting other forms of knowledge recording and transmission is critical here. Because often our histories as LGBTQ plus Catholics, often the histories of Black Catholics, of Latino Catholics, are dismissed or not recorded for not being historically relevant or important.
Mm-hmm.
And those are histories of frameworks of historical
Mm-hmm.
erasure and historical violence that
Mm-hmm.
continue to happen today.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very excited and passionate about how you highlighted this as a piece of that work. And it
Mm-hmm.
ties to the Middletown studies, which very much focus on oral history work instead of
Right.
archival work,
Yeah.
because little documentation is left behind.
Mm-hmm. There you go. That's right. And there's so much wisdom. The Spirit works so prophetically in people's lived stories, right? So we have
Absolutely.
to trust that the Spirit is there and follow the promptings of the Spirit as she reveals herself in us and in the people that we listen to.
Absolutely. And in our penultimate question, what have you seen or experienced in Catholic communities that helps foster solidarity across racial, cultural, or ideological divides? And what practices actually support meaningful engagement rather than performative allyship?
Mm-hmm. I think we haven't seen it. I think we haven't seen enough. And I think in part it is because trying to we haven't seen enough of those things, because part of it is resisting the desire on the part of white folks to arrive at quick solutions for these things, like being action oriented, like, well, if we could just get a strategic plan around this, we can make this happen. I think we haven't seen a lot of it because there's deep seated distrust and wounds that we have yet to really receive and heal on the part of marginalized Catholics. whether that's marginalized by gender identity or marginalized by racial identity. I think we haven't seen a lot of it because those communities are also, in truth, quite exhausted and are really in a space of we have to survive as communities, and so that those opportunities for deep interracial work are kind of few and far between. But I will share two examples. One, there's a neat movement here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia called it's called New Encounters: Catholics Confronting Racism. It's started by a colleague of mine and a dear friend, Mary Laver, who is a community organizer who just was kind of convinced that, man, Catholics and organizing needs to contend with histories of racism in the Catholic Church in cities like Philadelphia. And so this is a collaboration of white and predominantly Black or Black and multiracial parishes in the city who are trying to live up to and out of our own Archbishop's important pastoral letter that some folks helped him write on racial healing. So that is, it's a group that's just committed to journeying together, to being together, to praying together, to reflecting together, to telling honest stories together. And I think so that would be one really neat example. They led a pilgrimage through some of the sites of racial wounding this spring, right, for educators. And that's actually the group. One of those educators is the person who's invited me to come to her to meet with her colleagues on her faculty this afternoon. So I think that kind of relationship building and getting curious about stories and story sharing is really important. I think for me, one of the reasons that I've gone all in on synodality as a way of being church is because I actually do think that synodality can be a distinctively Catholic resource for racial healing and justice work. And I think a big part of that has to do with the way in which it's about pulling people around tables, circular tables, or if you're in a set of chairs, kind of knee to knee, reflecting on your shared story and experience, and really trying to make the Holy Spirit the protagonist of what God might be trying to do in and through particular communities. And I think it's something that blends something that we either do one of two things in the Catholic Church. We either think about racism as something that is a spiritual wound that just individual folks need some conversion around. Conversion of heart is then going to really be the solution to racism, and it kind of misses the structural and systemic change needed. Or sometimes we lead with that, like, we've got to undo these systems, we've got to undo these structures, and miss the way in which that first revolution, as community organizers will say, any revolution begins with an internal revolution. I think in synodality, we have spiritual renewal and structural reform on offer. And I'm excited to continue to think about the ways in which that can be a resource for us as we try to do this work of repair, this work of healing, this work of responding to what's unfolding in our contemporary context. So I'm very heartened by the witness of the folks who around the world have participated in that process. I'm excited that we have a leader in Pope Leo who has named it as the antithesis or the antidote. Maybe not, he didn't say antithesis, he said antidote to polarization and fragmentation and fracture. I don't think he said fascism, but I think it can be an antithesis to fascism because it's about building up the power of people together and resisting the exercise of authority over people. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful about that and all in on synodality.
Well, you took my last question. You answered it in there, which is totally fine. But I also think that some of what you said there in your last answer, I probably will have to sit and chew with later. I know that when I personally, so a little bit of my background is that I lived in a fully conservative bubble for most of my life, even going to a super conservative Catholic university, Franciscan University of Steubenville, and then eventually managed to kind of make it out through the lens of my transition, realizing that was not lining up, and that didn't line up with this idea of well, God made you this way, and you only are ever going to be in this role. There's no other possibilities. There's no divine imagination. There's no, and I remember that one of the things that I encountered for the first time, and I mean, it was also Pope Francis kind of bringing it, foregrounding it and making it a thing again, was synodality. And I remember being so honestly moved by that here was an opportunity to actually air the voices of all of the people of God, and not just leave the church in this top-down structure that can honestly reinforce some of these issues that we're talking about, when you have this one authority that is, top down and in that way. So yeah, I may be wandering a little here, but I just wanted to emphasize that synodality piece, I can really see the importance of power in it. And so I really will be sitting with what you said about it.
Yeah. I think we're going to be sitting with synodality. I hope we're going to be sitting with synodality for a long time. And I think you're right to name, Max, that this is a revival of an ancient practice. And in truth, we're just returning to some of the visions of church and the roles of people within the church from the Second Vatican Council. A colleague and friend from John Carroll University, an ecclesiologist, Ed Hannenberg, he summed up synodality as it's about how we exercise agency in the church. And so I do think that this brings us back to the conversation about high control Catholicism. In high control Catholicism, there's a fear about exercising agency. Who gets to exercise it? To what end? And I think the invitation of synodality, at the heart of synodality, is we've got to really start to wrestle with how does authority function and how does power function in a hierarchical church. And that there's not an easy answer to that, other than to say it requires an ethic of risk, which is different than an ethic of control. And risk meaning humility, vulnerability, curiosity, a willingness to make the Holy Spirit the protagonism that calls forth the protagonism of other people, and an ability to recognize and receive the protagonism of other people, especially the folks whose protagonism has either not been honored or received, or has been outright rejected, right? Has been outright denied, which is part of the reason that I'm so invested with Discerning Deacons, right? About reclaiming history of women's agency in the mission of the church, serving the mission of the gospel.
I think that's beautifully said, and so important. And so before we end here, I just want to give Emma one last opportunity if she has anything to add.
I really don't. I agree with you, Max. I think there's so much from this conversation that I'm excited to chew on, and so many connection points about past work that I've done that now feels incredibly reticent and relevant to the work we do of high control religion. I just wanted to say thank you, Maureen, for being here and for your contributions to the field and to us in this conversation. We really appreciate it.
Well, the feeling is mutual. Like, I would just want to say again, thank you for this invitation. Thank you for introducing me to some new ideas that help re-energize me and remind me of, like, yes, there's still more to do. And there's a community of folks. Like, there is a community of folks who want to walk together in doing it. So just super grateful for your own prophetic witness in that regard, and helping to build those communities in lots of different places.
These kinds of conversations remind us that Catholic identity is always being shaped by history, by power, and by the choices we make in community.
And when we're willing to confront uncomfortable truths, we open up the possibility of a church that's more honest, more just, and more faithful to the gospel.
That's the hope we're holding on to, even when the work is hard.
Thanks for listening to Whiplash. As always, you can find us on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Until next time.
Goodbye.